Hello and welcome to October Days for Sustainable Development, brought to you by the European Investment Bank. My name's Tanya Beckett and it's fantastic to have you all with us. This is the 7th edition of this conference and we're very proud to have quite a history building up now. This year's topic is cities, smart to human. From the sprawling Tokyo, very interconnected but sprawling nonetheless, to the very ambitious skyline of Dubai, the question is, what sort of cities do people want to live in and what sort of cities are sustainable? We hope that we'll be able to answer that question, at least mostly, in the course of this afternoon. As I've said, the European Investment Bank is bringing you this conference, but there are other collaborators, the University of Luxembourg being one of them, and Caritas, and also the UN Habitat Network Nature. And we'll be hearing from them a little bit in a moment. Before, though, I just want to say to you that you can communicate with us. We're going to bring up a WhatsApp number that you can talk to us on the screen through if you have questions during the course of the afternoon. We'd like to hear from you so that we can include them in our panel discussion a little bit later on. So without further ado, let's now go to the first of two videos I want to show you from the organisers. The first from the European Investment Bank.
The European Investment Bank is the lending arm of the European Union. We're the biggest multilateral financial institution in the world and a leading provider of climate finance.
More than 70% of the world population live in cities. Cities are vulnerable to climate shock and health emergency. In the wake of COVID-19, cities can offer solutions as center of innovation and creativity.
At the EIB, we finance solutions for low-carbon, climate-resilient urban development, for greener transport, for energy-efficient buildings, for water and waste management, for healthy neighborhoods, and for green spaces where people can live fulfilling lives.
The EIB Group stands ready to play its part. We must turn our pandemic recovery into a defining moment in our fight against climate change and environmental degradation, and into building more resilient and inclusive communities.
What does a smart and human city look like for you?
Let us discuss together how to create better cities.
We are excited to have you with us today.
So that, I think, partly sets the scene. I've said one of the other contributors in the organisation of this conference is the University of Luxembourg. So let's set the scene with a little video from them.
Dear friends, I want to welcome you all to the 7th edition of the October Days for Sustainable Development, dedicated to rethinking cities. The University of Luxembourg, with its Belleval campus of Esch-sur-Alzette, is a key actor of a city that is rethinking itself, bringing back to a new life a past industrial site.
Our campuses are integrated with the growing urban system in Luxembourg and are constantly evolving to respond to the challenges of the Climate Pact. Our top priorities are to streamline the administrative processes, select outstanding and talented employees, and to organize and relocate university structures in the best functional and sustainable way.
Arts and education contribute to a more equitable and sustainable way to live our cities. The humanities and social sciences provide us with guidelines and orientation in today's world and help foster resilience. We need a long-term vision for understanding and coping with the challenges of the environmental crisis.
The University of Luxembourg believes in development that is sustainable. We prioritize our relationship with the cities, hosting our different campuses, and promote the engagement of our staff and student communities into the life of the cities, contributing to this unique blend of views and competencies that makes the university so relevant.
So I think those two videos set the stage a little bit. I haven't mentioned this, but it is the case that Luxembourg is very much at the leading edge of this type of thinking in terms of human and smart cities. So it's fitting, therefore, that we should hear from the Minister for the Environment, Climate and Sustainable Development from the Government of Luxembourg. Please welcome Carole Dieschbourg.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, once again this year, I'm delighted to address a few words to you at the opening of the October Days. Making Luxembourg a climate-neutral country with more livable and sustainable cities is a top priority on our national agenda. We are moving fast and with resolution in this direction. Luxembourg has given itself a framework for climate action with a new climate law, the National Energy and Climate Plan, and finally a long-term strategy. For 2030, we are targeting a reduction of 55% in greenhouse gas emissions compared to 2005, and we aim to reach climate neutrality by 2050 at the latest. The long-term strategy on climate action defines the strategic vision, identifies guidelines as well as the main fields of action and strategic measures. A crucial cross-cutting field of action is spatial and urban planning. For a successful transition to climate neutrality in 2050, sustainable and circular districts are a key component. Collaborative processes are supporting the transition in this field. The latest public consultation being Luxembourg in Transition, engaging over 30 citizens over the course of a whole year. Because participation is key. The National Climate Law has created two climate governance bodies, a platform for energy transition and climate action, and a scientific climate policy observatory. We need everybody on board for better communities and a climate-neutral Europe. For this very reason, we created a brand new Climate Pact 2.0 and a Nature Pact, involving local authorities, making our towns and municipalities more resilient and thus ensuring to take everyone along the path to climate neutrality. Thank you all for listening.
Minister for the Environment and Sustainable Development from the Government of Luxembourg, Carole Dieschbourg there. Now, all of this thinking about smart cities and, of course, sustainable development goals come under the heading or are in the context of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. It's very fitting, then, that we should hear from the UN. And Maimunah Mohd Sharif, who is the Undersecretary-General of the United Nations. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Dear Dean Francisco de Paula Coelho, dear colleagues of the European Investment Bank Institute, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me to the 7th edition of the October Days for Sustainable Development, Rethinking Cities from Smart into Human. This is an honor and a pleasure for me to be here today to share some reflection on cities and human settlement in the post-pandemic world. Next slide, please. In a span of a few months, our world has been transformed in a manner that none of us anticipated. The novel coronavirus pandemic triggered the worst public health crisis in a century, and we are now living through the worst economic recession since the Great Depression. With over 90% of confirmed cases coming from urban areas, cities remain the epicenter of COVID-19. And in our rapidly urbanizing and globalized world, the virus has spread to virtually every corner of the globe, first among globally connected cities and now through community transmission from the city to the countryside. And above all, COVID-19 is reversing the gains made in poverty eradication and is pushing back the possibility of attaining the Sustainable Development Goals by at least a decade, if not more. COVID-19 has exposed and exacerbated underlying inequalities in cities. The poor are the most vulnerable and the most likely to die from the disease. Informal workers dependent on daily wages have been deprived of their livelihood. Children without internet access have lost a year of formal education. Elderly persons facing risk and stigmatization are confined to their home with no opportunities for social interaction. Migrant workers return home after dangerous journeys to face a future of poverty. Others are confined to dormitories with high exposure to the disease. Minorities groups have also been disproportionately affected. Women were forced to juggle childcare, education, and work without access to school and daycare services. Essential workers continue to toil tirelessly and at a great personal risk to ensure that our urban services function uninterrupted. At the same time, this unprecedented crisis has presented us with an unexpected opportunity. And allow me to quote the United Nations Secretary-General here, who said, "We cannot go back to business as usual. Cities and communities are demanding that those in authority take the opportunity to build back better, to emerge stronger. We need a sustainable, inclusive, and green recovery for people and the planet. That means dealing with the existing challenges of how cities are planned, managed, and financed, and ensuring their development is compatible with the goals of net zero emission by 2050. Next slide, please. Ladies and gentlemen, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goal was agreed by member states for people, planet, and prosperity in 2015. And today, progress is being made in many places on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and their 169 targets. But overall, action to meet the goal is not yet advancing at the speed or scale required. In September 2019, the UN Secretary-General called on all sectors of society to mobilize for a decade of action, calling for accelerating sustainable solutions to all the world's biggest challenges, ranging from poverty and gender to climate change, inequality, and closing the financial gap. This is taking place on 3 levels. At the global action to secure greater leadership, more resources, and smarter solutions for sustainable development goals. And at the local level, embedding the needed transition in policies, budget, institution, regulatory framework of government, cities and local authorities, and the people action, including by youth, civil society, the media, the private sector, unions, academia, and other stakeholders to generate an unstoppable movement pushing for the required transformation. UN Habitat has been asked with UNDP, have been tasked with UNDP to co-chair the Local 2030 Coalition, a flagship initiative of the Decade of Action. The coalition seeks to harness urbanization processes to assist member states work more effectively at the local level to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. The COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on all 17 SDGs had shown that what began as a health crisis has quickly become a human and social economic crisis. While the crisis is setting us back, it also makes the achievement of the SDGs more urgent and necessary. A transformative recovery from COVID-19 should be pursued, one that addresses the crisis, reduce risk from future potential crises, and relaunch the implementation effort to deliver the 2030 Agenda, and SDGs during the decade of action. The Paris Agreement, a legally binding international treaty on climate change, was also agreed by the UN member state in 2015 and has now been ratified by all countries. It is a landmark in the multilateral climate change process because for the first time, a binding agreement brings all nations into a common cause to undertake ambitious effort to combat climate change and adapt to its effect. Cities are an important part of the global effort on stronger climate action, both in mitigation and adaptation. I will soon be attending COP26 in Glasgow, which had to be rescheduled because of the COVID crisis. So the main goals of COP26 are to encourage parties to come forward with ambitious, nationally determined contributions that establish their emission reductions target for 2030 and discuss adaptation measures, increase climate finance, and finalize the Paris Rulebook, the detailed rules that make the Paris Agreement operational. In another cross-section, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of UK, stressed the four main goals being coal, cars, cash, and trees, and said that every country needs to do their part in achieving these goals. Next slide, please. In 2016, in Quito, Ecuador, member states adopted the new urban agenda, which works an accelerator of the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, particularly SDG 11, to provide a comprehensive framework to guide and track urbanization around the globe. UN Habitat's work centers on supporting member states and all other stakeholders in implementing this agenda. Next slide, please. Ladies and gentlemen, it is only fitting that we take this conversation forward during Urban October. Urban October starts with World Habitat Day, celebrated on the first Monday of October each year, to World Cities Day, which is always celebrated on October 31st, and hence the whole urban month. This year, the World Habitat Day Global Celebration was held in Yaoundé, Cameroon, and focused on the theme, Accelerating Urban Action for a Carbon-Free World. World Cities Day will be celebrated globally, but especially in Luxor, Egypt, with a focus on better city, better life, adapting cities for climate resilience. Urban October aims to raise awareness, promote participation, generate knowledge, and engage an international community towards a new urban agenda in 31 days of promoting a better urban future. We encourage all planners and all partners to plan and organize activities during the month. Why did we choose to focus on climate for the Urban October 2021? As I already noted, the pandemic has set us back on our effort to achieve the SDG and the Paris Agreement, but it has provided us with a once-in-a-generation opportunity to shape our post-pandemic future, which is not only healthy, but also green and just, because putting people on the path to recovery after the pandemic is not different from accelerating the achievement of the SDGs or pushing ahead on climate change mitigation and adaptation. To twist the phrase, there are three sides of the same coin. Next slide, please. Earlier this year, we at UN Habitat produced a report on cities and pandemics towards a more just, green, and healthy future. And in this report, we present an analysis of the situation of the COVID-19 in cities and urban area 1 year after the declaration of pandemic, and outline a range of bold measures that could deliver the lasting and sustainable recovery from the current crisis. These include, first, rethinking the form and the function of the city. urban morphologies and systems should be reconfigured at different scale to not only enhance their resilience to the effect of the pandemic, but also make them more sustainable and productive through inclusive planning. Spanning a range of scales from regions and territories to neighborhoods and buildings, the promotion of compact design, accessible mobility, and mixed land use can support the development of safer, more livable urban environment. Second, addressing systemic poverty and inequality in cities. Targeted intervention should be designed to mitigate disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 and related restriction on poor and vulnerable groups through emergency assistance and service provision, at the same time taking steps to address the underlying causes of their exclusion. While overcrowding and the absence of basic services have raised the health risk of the pandemic for poorer residents, lack of access to digital services, and the decline in informal sector activities during lockdowns have left them in an even more precarious economic state. Third, rebuilding a new normal urban economy. A suite of tailored economic support and relief packages should be developed to help smaller businesses, informal workers, and at-risk sectors to survive the crisis, with an emphasis on building back better by promoting the transition to greener, more equitable urban economies. Though cash-strapped local authorities may be tempted to respond to these pressures by scaling back their commitments, it is essential that they continue with the support of national governments to maintain services and financial assistance to help residents and businesses survive the crisis. The fourth, clarifying urban legislation and governance arrangement. Authorities must recognize the needs of more integrated, cooperative, multi-level governance with an emphasis on developing more flexible and innovative institutional and financial framework, and government at national, subnational, and local level have been forced to respond creatively to the unfolding crisis in many different ways, whether through greater collaboration, increased autonomy, or a re-centralization of certain responsibilities. While the outcomes have been uneven and frequently contested, they have also generated new approaches and learning that should not be forgotten once the pandemic has come to an end. Next slide, please. And as we did not limit our engagement in helping our stakeholders to fight the COVID crisis to analysis and recommendation only. In parallel, building on more than 40 years of urban experience, much of it in humanitarian situation, we focus on the city-level response to the crisis. We developed a COVID-19 response plan for action, and we launched an appeal and a campaign and a range of immediate response and longer-term recovery activities at the corporate, regional, and country levels. From March to August 2020, early in the crisis, UN Habitat supported the overall response to the pandemic in 64 countries and more than 250 cities, benefiting 6.8 million people, the majority of being residents of slums and informal settlements. This work is still ongoing. Next slide, please. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, we at UN Habitat are guided by our strategic plan for 2020 to 2023 approved by the member state, which is based on UN Habitat's new vision of a better quality of life for all in an urbanizing world. This vision is encapsulated in the plan's 4 domains of change, namely reduce spatial inequality and poverty in communities across the urban-rural continuum, enhance shared prosperities of cities and regions, strengthen climate action and improve urban environment, and effective urban crisis prevention and response. As pronounced by the UN Habitat Committee of Permanent Representatives, our strategic plan continues to be relevant and robust during this unprecedented crisis. It is clear that sustainable urbanization and the work and mandate of UN Habitat is more important than ever before. Next slide, please. Let me offer you some glimpse that the milestone conversation to come in the near future that focus on this agenda. In April 2022, a high-level meeting on the implementation of the new urban agenda will take place in New York. This is a mandated meeting of the UN General Assembly on the implementation of the outcomes of the Habitat 3 conference. The planning of this meeting is at an early stage, and member states will decide which shape it takes and what outcomes it will produce. But I can safely say that many different stakeholders will be included in the process of preparation and conclusions. We hope that the European Union, including the European Investment Bank, will be active stakeholders in this process. Between 26th to 30th of June in Katowice, Poland, the 11th edition of the World Urban Forum will take place, focusing on transforming our cities for a better urban future. The World Urban Forum is the premier goal conference on sustainable urbanization convened by UN Habitat. It's always attract tens of thousands of stakeholders, and we expect the European Union and the European Investment Bank to join this prime global forum on urbanization and share their achievement with the global audience. May I use this opportunity to invite all those present today to join us in Katowice, Poland. Next slide, please. Before I conclude, let me turn to the understanding of the collaboration that we have building with the European Investment Bank in the past couple of years. This collaboration was extremely important to the joint effort to build back better. I met Mr. Werner Hoyer, President of European Investment Bank in Dhaka in February 2020 when we together organized EIB and UN Habitat Africa Day. We have achieved good mutual understanding and agreed to give special focus to energy efficiency and climate action standards in urban development, in housing, to reach our shared objective in supporting the climate objective. Next slide, please. We concluded that our common effort shows that access to finance alone will not help improve sustainable urbanization in the developing countries unless it serves the goal of well-planned urban development, framed by strategies on all levels of government, national, regional, and local. As contribution to the decade of action to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals and in response to the call of the Secretary-General of the United Nations for accelerating sustainable solution to all the world's biggest challenge, ranging from poverty and gender to climate change, inequality, closing the gap, the finance gap, we now endeavors to achieve closer cooperation in supporting and preparing bankable projects, where sustainable urban development is a key factor for successful investment. We aim to exchange experience and, where required, support each other through technical level cooperation, sharing standards and concepts, and UN Habitat focusing on public policies of sustainable urban development and adequate housing, and the EIB focusing on project financing in this respect, and when required, mobilizing other partners to contribute to our joint efforts. We are now exploring how we can work together in several countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and it looks very, very promising. Ladies and gentlemen, the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic is an opportunity for the world cities to put climate action on top of their agenda. Cities are indeed the incubator of innovation and new technology. We must harness this strength for better climate change solution. This is a chance to change how we generate our power, construct our building, heat, cool, and light up our offices and home, and travel around from home to work. We need clean, resource-efficient energy to replace fossil fuel. We need energy-efficient infrastructure to encourage walking and cycling. And we need well-planned, well-managed compact cities that allow for non-motorized transport to reduce energy consumption from cooling and heating, so the natural and built environment come together in greater harmony. Climate action will differ from city to city, but we must make sure the green transition benefits everyone, especially the most vulnerable, and create new jobs. The only way forward is for everyone to work together to ensure that our climate goals are met through implementation of the new urban agenda to achieve the sustainable development goals. Let me also stress the importance of greater multi-level coordination between international, national, and local government, especially when investing in and implementing stimulus program, so that we can truly build back better, greener, and fairer, while also protecting our communities. Please allow me to conclude with a reminder that while we need to leave no one behind and ensure environmental and climate neutrality dimension, we must also remember the economic realities. When we call for smart human, the climate neutral cities, we must also seek that investment in urban development responds to the dual purpose to increase quality of life for all people by investing in sustainable urban development, but we must also make sure that investment increases economic productivity, which give all people more opportunities for higher income and reduces inequality so that everyone can afford the benefit of improved standards of life quality. It is why we agreed with the European Investment Bank to promote well-planned and managed urban development in the context of rapid urbanization, to create the potential for increased economic productivity and thus enabling achievement of the top-tier goals, such as equitable productivity increases coupled with job creation, a greener and climate-smart economy, as well as poverty reduction and improvements in the quality of life for all citizens. Our common objective is to position urban development as a driver of sustainable development and a vehicle to achieve these top-tier goals. Next slide, please. I would like to say thank you to you and thank you for having me and UN Habitat together with your great events. Over to you. Thank you.
More aspects to the debate. Thank you very much indeed. We now turn to our panel, but before we get there, it's important just to say that we have a lady called Caroline who's going to be doing drawings throughout the conference that we'll be coming back to. And in fact, let's go to her now and see how she's getting on. Caroline. There we are. Thinking cities from smart to human. That is very much the theme underpinning what we're talking about this afternoon. Leave no one behind. We've just been hearing this message very strongly from the UN that social justice, and I think we'll be hearing a lot more of that, is very key to the thinking as we move beyond the pandemic and redesign our cities in the future. Agile systems, that's going to be a theme as well that we'll pick up on. Sustainable cities. Again, that's something that we're going to elaborate on. And poverty here very much featuring again and again, and climate action, of course, in that speech that we've just heard from the UN. So let me now just remind you once again that you can contact us and we'd like to hear from you during the course of the next hour or so on WhatsApp. And we have a WhatsApp number that's coming up there, I believe. Yes. And you can send your questions to that WhatsApp number. We'd love to hear from you. Allow me then to introduce our panelists for further discussion. Let's start off with Charles-Antoine Desseux. I hope I've got my French accent right on that, Charles. He is an expert really in the circular economy and how that relates to buildings. He can no doubt explain that a bit better. He's also the CEO of a company called Helismart, and he will explain no doubt a little bit more about that. We're also delighted to have Jette Hoop, who is scarily multilingual, quite extraordinary with her language skills, and grew up very much in a variety of countries, and that's what helped no doubt develop those language skills, and speaks perfect English as well, which is terrifying. But she's been involved in some very exciting international projects, and I hope that she's going to tell us a bit more about those, and no doubt she will. Holger Robrecht, who is the Deputy Regional Director from ICLEA at the European Secretariat, and also Ilona, who is an expert on European regional and urban planning and development. So we've really got everybody from the micro to the macro here, and that's how we're going to take the discussion. So each of them are going to show us some pictures of projects that they've been involved in, or things that really illustrate where they come from. And we're going to start, as I've said, with the micro and move to the macro. So we're going to start with Charles and his company, what he does and how he sees the future of building. Charles, over to you.
So yeah, it's a great pleasure to be with you today and to show you a bit what we are going towards and what is happening, and we are trying to lead the way. You can perhaps put the first picture, which will allow me to show a bit what we are doing. The company, my company Helio Smart, is actually dedicated to build buildings that will be rebuilt. And that has been developed under the name of Nesto because the nest is the perfect building that is being to be rebuilt all the time, repaired, restored, and reused. And we started with the first building in Luxembourg a few years ago, which really was all around the circular economy. And the circular economy, as you know, is just being the opposite of it's the cradle to cradle principle rather than cradle to grave. The linear economy is the opposite. And what we want here is that all the elements we use in construction, in our developments, is actually reused. This is the way to make sure that we do not depend on resources that are becoming scarce and on fluids that come from origins that cannot be replenished or get depleted, like fossil fluids, which is obvious for heating. So you see here a building that is completely conceived and built in a factory, which has a big advantage. It's a wooden frame building, which allows to have a very high level of insulation. And if you put the next slide, you will see how the assembling of these buildings happen. It's really interesting because the whole building was built in 3 days, and this is a 3-story building, which I think is. But that's what's going to happen more and more in the future, and I don't think the old way of putting blocks on the top of each other will be sustainable in the future. Circular economy includes a lot of aspects. One of these aspects is the short circuit. And we want products to come from near origins, from short distance sources. Another element is actually pushing OPEX versus CAPEX. Why should you why should you buy products that are actually planned to be obsolescent? Why should you buy a laundry washer when you need your laundry to be washed? Why should you buy bulbs when you need light? So all this is organized inside the concept, which means that we are going for pay as you use rather than buying machinery or appliances. You can put the next slide. What you see also a very important element is producing the energy that the building is using. Of course, this energy is consumed for heating, for lighting, and for different appliances. and certainly the photovoltaic panels on the roof cover the whole need of the building for 1 year, which makes it also an autonomous building. The whole topic there, of course, is that at the end of a circle, the end of a cycle, the building will be dismantled, all the elements will be recovered and reused in new buildings. And that's the principle of circular economy. But of course, the most important thing, buildings are only buildings, but we are here not to talk about smart cities, but about human cities. And if you put the next slide, you can see one of those people who actually need the buildings that we are building, because our next topic or our main target is actually also to break the vicious circle of the only two variables in housing development, which are space and location. We do believe that people need to have a decent habitat if they want to have a decent life, and this is about social inclusion. And this is the only way, is to make sure that these buildings, and specifically the ones that I've shown you, is also affordable. And the people who are behind it desperately need that, because real estate is becoming more and more expensive, and in some cities just unaffordable. You can put the next slide, please. So what you see here is the inside of one of these apartments that have been built, actually quite comfortable for 2 parents and 2 children. It's been here fully furnished. And it includes, for instance, and that's important for health, no volatile organic compounds, VOCs, as you might be familiar with. They are located in areas where it is possible to raise a family. There's always a school in the neighborhood. Mobility is an important element. E-bikes are available. And also making sure that you can work in the neighborhoods, or at least that you can be mobile and take a train or a bus to go and work. And last but not least, to have a social life. So you can put the next slide. And this is basically the finished product, which we are reproducing. Of course, it's not always the same building, because urban planning is quite complicated and requires to fulfill all sort of regulations and policies. But at the end, we have a building which is comfortable, nice, very healthy, and which is available to those who need it most and who can otherwise not afford it. Thank you.
Charles, thank you very much indeed. And I think that's an excellent focus on the residential aspect of what we're talking about. We're now going to hear from Jette, and she's going to talk briefly, just 5 minutes or so, about some of the projects that she's been involved in. Jette, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. Yeah, let me give a short introduction to our practice and values and the projects related. So if you can please put up the first slide. Thank you very much. For you that haven't heard about this kind of strange name with the pronunciation the Snøhetta mountain that you can see here in the middle of the image. Snøhetta is a global practice within architecture, landscape architecture and design disciplines. And since over 30 years we have borrowed our name from this mountain Snøhetta. And that is a very conscious approach, because we say Snøhetta is a mountain that that everyone can go to, but no one belongs to it. So it says something about our collaborative approach. And since our inception, we have maintained this originally transdisciplinary approach and really putting the access to landscape and architecture and all the built context in the focus of our work. So next slide, please. And operating globally with offices in Oslo, where I'm sitting and speaking from today, and New York, Hong Kong, Adelaide, Francisco, Innsbruck, and Paris, what you maybe can see here that our projects are not driven of a formal or a stylistic interest, but you will rather see a kind of the focus on the democratic access to nature, buildings and landscapes, kind of based on a set of Nordic values that are focused on and based on democracy, accessibility and equality. So increasing kind of, and having this kind of in the center of our attention also leads us to a very content-driven approach that you can see as a basis of in all our projects. So next slide, please. And as the most prominent, or one of a very prominent example is the opera in Oslo. Because our goal was to create a sense of immediate ownership to the space for every visitor, independent from its relation to the cultural context, meaning to be dependent on a ticketing. So it has several levels, this building. At the one end is of course a state-of-the-art cultural building, but at the other end it also deals with the urban context. It was a catalyst of an urban development and the formal industrial area of Oslo, but it was also about bringing this kind of the cultural context closer to the visitor and to a larger variety of visitors, kind of giving the site back to the citizens of Oslo and all the guests related. So I think it says very much about our approach to this type of project and architecture per se. It's very well representative for the social sustainability that is embedded in all our projects. Next, please. And this kind of approach, this kind of right to roam, that is also a Scandinavian heritage, that you allow to use landscape independent from private property rights. You can also see that in our work for the reconstruction of the Times Square in New York. And I mean, it's maybe one of the busiest urban situations in the world, with about over 300,000 visitors crossing Times Square every day. And our work was mainly about kind of bringing the square back to the citizens of New York, because they hated it as it was before, but it was also about doubling the pedestrian space. But it shows also, and that is something that we quantify in our post-occupancy study, how kind of well-conceived urban design can also have an impact on public safety, on the air quality, the economic output, and as the project stands as a model for how the carefully considered design of urban landscape can improve the health and well-being of its users, while also providing an important space for democratic gathering. So I think it's you see kind of how our contextual understanding and how we kind of try to improve this generosity in public space is also represented here. So next, please, next slide. Yeah, and as you saw in Snøhetta, we have a long-standing tradition for designing socially sustainable structures, and for the last 12 years we have also increased our focus on environmental sustainability designs, particularly represented in our Powerhouse project. And I think it's really an interesting collaborative model, also getting a better understanding that the architects disciplines alone cannot solve our environmental crisis that we and where our industry has actually quite a large footprint. So within the Powers collaboration with this, which is an alliance between major players within the Norwegian building industry, we design carbon positive, energy positive buildings, and SNERT as the lead architect. And what you see here is an example. It's actually the world northernmost energy positive building. It's about an 80,000 square meter office building located in Trondheim in Norway. And what is particular also for the powerhouse ambition, it's not about only create energy positive building, but we include also the entire embodied energy lifespan over 60 years. So this is, as far as I know, still one of the most ambitious sustainability definition within our industry. And next, please. And I want to close off with an example that we are currently working on in Milan. And this is quite a large urban development that we have won within the C40 initiative. And it's about converting a former slaughterhouse area into an urban development. And what is central to the proposal is really the regeneration, or what you can see, of the legacy building, ensuring the preservation of the site's rich cultural and architectural heritage, but also helping the environment through circularity of the building and reusing about 40,000 square meters of the existing building structure, which obviously also have an impact on the need of new materials. So we are really looking forward with this project to showcase a completely new direction for carbon neutral neighborhood. And we are really looking forward to the next years where we will focus on this urban development. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yes, and thank you very much indeed. Some really inspiring projects there. I would like now to go to Holger Robrecht, who, as I've said, is the Deputy Regional Director at ICLE, the European Secretariat. Holger, over to you.
Me here on behalf of ICLE, Local Governments for Sustainability, which is a global network of sustainable development leaders in the urban context. We have 2,500 cities and regions. I think rethinking cities is actually a very good motto also for us. Obviously, there is good reasons to rethink cities locally from the perspective that pandemics, for example, climate disasters, environmental diseases question the urban development approach that we've been doing, and globally because the urbans are the ones that basically drive our planet beyond boundaries, and these are two different perspectives that are combined also in our network. I'm just coming back from the European Urban Resilience Forum, and the head of the European Commission's DG Climate Adaptation Unit, Elena Wisner-Malinowska, said that nature-based solutions are a non-brainer from a climate resilience perspective, as it also is a multifaceted and multi-beneficial element to use in redoing urban development. And this is very much actually also an important aspect for ICLE members that are committed to urban transformation. And actually, they are committed in a way that they have determined 5 urban transformation pathways, with one of them being nature-based development, very much hinting, obviously, of the necessity to introduce nature-based solutions in urban planning. Others also include, for example, circular development or resilient development, but also people-centered development, which is a very important element for us as well. So it's a good moment to potentially think of nature-based solutions and what they can do. And when we look at nature, it might be in cities, it might be a tree, obviously, but a tree can also be something different. It can be a nature-based solutions, nature-based solutions. that is inspired, supported by nature, cost-effective, simultaneously providing environmental, social, and economic benefits, and build resilience. I've brought you a couple of examples for what that can actually be from European projects that are featured in our Urban by Nature program. And if you go to the next slide, please, you see that we have actually elements that are manufactured and can be combined. I present here a picture from the city of Luxembourg that is a green living room that can be organized to fight heat island effects in city areas. But it also, of course, has a realm of environmental education. People can enjoy a space that is newly created in a mobile format in different urban settings. If you go to the next slide, please. This is a nature-based solution that is sort of creating a noise barrier, so it can actually separate transport space from more quiet space, and at the same time, it is also helping the air quality because the plants obviously filter also pollutants from the air. If you go to the next slide, please. But there are also other pilots that are meanwhile going into different areas. This is from Bros-Monceau in France. It's actually a phyto restore place where the sewage treatment is being handled, and they have treated sewage contaminated by COVID-19 virus, and they have actually managed some very good results to filter out the virus from the sewage. But of course, is not only about virus; it's also about other pollutants in sewage. If we go further, please. In Nanterre, they have combined sort of like landscape aspects, beautification of a river area with actually irrigation, also using the Archimedean screw, which is a very, very interesting technical element also here. So it's basically a self-sustaining water park that obviously help people to use the city also in a very human way. But these are only individual elements. Nature-based solutions need to be combined. And if you go to the next slide, please, we can understand that they combine into an infrastructure that helps really a different design and a different approach to cities. This is an example from Freiburg. You easily can see that nature-based solutions combine into a strategically planned network of natural and semi-natural areas, employing and applying various nature-based solutions here in a newly developed district. If you go one step further, I bring two examples from cities that have done that in a very strategic and planful manner. Hamburg, as part of the European Clever Cities project, has actually introduced different clever solutions, as they call it, and employed that in the district of Neugraben-Fischberg. And if you go one step further, please. You see that the different elements combine also here in Zagreb, Sesvete, which is also a slaughterhouse, like Jeppe has introduced it, combine in different ways at district level, so that basically it changes the urban design and scape. If you go one step further, please. But obviously, what is an issue here is how we can introduce that into planning. How can we mainstream nature-based solutions and make it sort of an element to rethink cities? And if you go one step further, we see that financing is always a very important element. We are here with the European Environment Bank. The first step towards that is to understand that this is a critical infrastructure. We are not just talking about a tree that is a tree, but we are talking about a tree that is combined into a strategically planned network that becomes a critical infrastructure to fight climate change consequences in urban areas, that help environmental health issues in urban areas, and it helps the livability. The Glasgow City Council, together with other partners, have actually tried to develop an investment platform in order to achieve their tree canopy goal, which is going to be launched in a couple of days from now in Glasgow at COP26, and it will hopefully help to pool and scale investments into both the plantation but also the maintenance of that green infrastructure. What is needed to do to redesign cities? Well, there are a couple of principles potentially to apply. The first of which is to really understand we are talking infrastructure. Second, cities are ecosystems in themselves, and they should be treated as such. We have the UN Decade on Ecosystems, Ecosystem Restoration just opened, and urban ecosystems is one of the pillars in it, but we don't have an appropriate answer to what that actually means. It mostly means redevelopment, regeneration, and creating ecosystems. The next point that I would like to make is that the nature-based investment is actually creating an asset, and this is what policymakers but also investors should understand. It's not a cost, it is an asset, and it is an asset that remains in the long term. I would like to close potentially with a hint to the urban planners. Of course, we need to, I'm a spatial planner myself, we need to rethink the approach that we have towards our cities, and that includes that we need definitely to put nature-based solutions in the forefront before we start planning and not in the aftermath of it. We should definitely do it in an integrated manner. We might need some different planning instruments. The European Union will launch an urban greening plan as an overarching umbrella instrument that should help to bridge the gaps between different instruments and by that also help to prioritize greening solutions in urban areas. But we potentially need to open space. The Barcelona superblocks might be a way also to look at, to really revalue space for green. Thank you.
Holger, thank you very much indeed. I'm expecting when we now just to briefly go back to Caroline Schuler, who's drawing away for us, that we'll probably see some trees in her drawings. Caroline. Yes, we can at the bottom there. Rebuilding buildings. This is what Charles brought up earlier on about build to rebuild, and we're going to quiz him on what he means by that a bit later on. Jette, remember, spoke about energy positive buildings, and so did Charles, and the circular economy. That was what Charles talked about. Affordability, and certainly the Nordic idea of more equitability in the way that we live is feeding into that, and quality of life. And there are the trees there at the bottom. I certainly like the idea of the green living room. I can't wait to get into one of those. Well, let's now come back to Ilona Eklona, who's also really on the planning side. She's an expert in space planning and regional and urban development. Let's hear from her on her views on the subject before we get into talking to all of our panelists. Over to you, Ilona.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to this discussion. I was also invited to share a couple of points to support the discussion on the green recovery. If I could get my slides to start. So I would specifically like to mention a couple of points regarding the impact of the pandemic on the green urban agenda and the way forward towards green recovery of cities during and after the pandemic. Next slide, please. So the researchers have started since the start of the pandemic to study the impact of the pandemic on environmental conditions, and what we can see is that it had a positive short-term impact on air quality and waste production, but researchers are also clear to say that this impact will not last, and it will be only short-term unless there are real structural changes implemented in the economic development, in the economic area and of the countries. Otherwise, this impact will definitely be only short-term. Another point that I would like to mention, next slide, please, is that the researchers have also started to study the correlation between environmental conditions and also vulnerability for COVID. And what they have found out is that there is a positive correlation between the poor quality of air and also the number of deaths from COVID. And this is also another very worrying factor, and also something that clearly justifies the need to act in the field of environment and act quickly in order to ensure that our vulnerability for COVID reduces in the long term. Now, all these both aspects, they clearly, next slide, please. They clearly justify the need for more greening, and what we also see is that there has been a clear demand from the people in Europe for structural change. If we look at the third edition of the European Investment Bank's climate survey, there you see a question on what should be the government's priority faced with economic crisis caused by COVID-19. And what we see as a response is that 57% of respondents of the EU think that the post-COVID recovery should reorient economy, taking into account the climate crisis, that is, that the recovery should clearly be green. Next slide, please. And what we see is that the cities have started to act. Since the start of the pandemic, the first response has been mainly related to health and economic development issues. Now, after already some time, we see that the response has become much more climate oriented. We see new bike lanes, in total 2,300 kilometers built throughout Europe. We see that cities have also set out and developed new plans to go fully green, for example, in Paris, by planting urban forests, organizing outdoor gyms, transforming city streets into pedestrian streets on weekends, and also reducing the speed and imposing speed limits. Also within the cities to ensure better environmental conditions in the long term. Now, if we move on to the next slide, I would also want to highlight some points regarding the way forward towards green urban recovery. And here I would also like to refer to what the UN has said and what we heard already from our keynote speaker. So according to UN, again, I would like to highlight 90% of COVID cases happened in cities worldwide, and this has exposed deep inequalities in the cities. So the UN has proposed a very comprehensive program for recovery, and that this is a chance to rethink urban living, address climate change, and also to prepare for future pandemics. And we see here a number of important long-term solutions. And here I would like to highlight an aspect of public green spaces. The UN has mentioned that less than 50% of global population at the moment can access open public spaces within 400 meters from home. Another worrying factor, next slide please, is what was identified by ESPON researchers in a study on sustainable urbanization and land use practices in European regions. So what they have found out is that about 1.17 million hectares of land were converted to urban land on urban use in Europe in 2000-2018 period, which equals to 248 football fields per day. And here I would like to mention that only 11% of this has become urban green. Another study, next slide please, performed by ESPON, also mentions that there's been changes in the share of urban green spaces between 2006 and 2012, and we see that most European places have experienced slight decrease of the share of urban green spaces. Another factor that we really need to consider, another fact that is at the moment worrying, and that indicates the need to invest more, to focus more on greening, to ensure better quality urban living, better quality urban environment. So next slide, please. in the quest for a better living environment, especially after the start of the pandemic. We see that green urban areas are in high demand. Everyone from digital nomads to families and from older to younger people seek a place that combines urban infrastructure and services with green spaces surrounding their working and living areas. And clearly, developing and expanding green infrastructure networks is one important priority to promote urban resilience. ESPON has conducted a study that highlights the benefits and also provides policy advice to develop green infrastructure networks. Next slide, please. It indicates a number of key benefits provided by green infrastructure at different scales, and we see here the benefits are both economic, they are social, they are environmental, and again, they lead to a higher, a better quality urban environment and urban living around Europe. And I will close by my last slide to say that ESPON study, the same one on green infrastructure, has also identified a spatial distribution of potential GI network at landscape level. And here we see quite a high potential around Europe for developing new green infrastructure networks. But what is important to mention here is that developing green infrastructure requires an integrated approach to spatial planning, and it should span beyond administrative borders and involve stakeholders from private and public sectors. So it requires more territorial and more cross-sectoral cooperation to become successful. Thank you for your attention.
Ilona, thank you very much indeed. It feels like a good moment to check in again with Caroline Schuler, who is drawing for us. And also when we, there we go. So we are, sewage techniques, innovative sewage techniques. She's put in the bottom there and a question there. So we'll be checking in with her as we continue the discussion. There has been a great deal of discussion about whether people want to live in cities at all as a result of the pandemic. Now, obviously, that depends on the quality of the city. If the quality of the city is good, then people would be very happy to do that. And we'll discuss what quality means, but obviously green spaces contribute to that. But I'd like to come back, if I may, first to you, Charles, and ask you, to what extent do you think people want to live in cities now? How has the pandemic changed all of that?
It has reduced. The cities have big advantages, obviously, culturally, socially, etc. The offer which is available is really exciting. What we've seen, and I've seen that with my own eyes, is that forests and pastures have just been walked around incredibly during the pandemic, and I think that nature has been rediscovered in reality by basically wandering. And that's an element that has to be taken into consideration, because it doesn't make any sense to keep the nature available to those who have the means to go and visit the nature outside of the town. I think, Alphonse Allais said cities should be built on the countryside because the air is much cleaner over there. And this is a bit what has happened during the pandemic. Now, we have to bring the nature back to the city.
Yes. Jette, you spoke a lot about equality and access to general spaces when you were showing us your pictures. What do you think people want now out of cities?
Well, it's actually interesting, because when you take Oslo as an example, there has been for years a huge pressure on the real estate market in the city center, and not enough residential area for everyone. And now, for the first time after the pandemic, we can see that there is a tendency that people are seeking outside of the city center. So this is really a new tendency that we have actually only seen the last year. And when it comes to the quality of the urban environment, as I might have understood correctly your question, I mean, it's obviously about the quality of the spaces, of the public areas that cities can offer to its citizens. So I think when we especially in our profession also, is our contribution can be to, of course, increase accessibility, but also then work with the enhanced quality of public spaces. And as an example here for Oslo, we just, together with the real estate developer, as Oslo has, especially the area around the opera in Oslo, has been developed with a high density over the last 10 years. And we, Snøhetta, together with the real estate developer, we have taken the last property left and trying to transform it into a public park. Really to see that now everything is occupied and nothing is left for the next generation, really to secure this last property and give it back to the urban context, just as an example.
Mm-hmm. Holger, if I can come to you, in terms of urban planning, it wasn't very long ago that we probably think about how the traffic was going to get through first and then how the people were going to live second. But much has changed during the pandemic. I guess the question is, has it changed for the long term?
Well, that's a very good point. I tend to believe, yes, it has changed. But still, it needs to underpinned also by, for example, professional training and education of us, of planners. I think we've learned really to organize the city basically for the throughput of materials, of people, of cars, whatever, energy. And we have now in the pandemic definitely also started to better understand what Jette also said, that we need to organize the place in order to stay on site. And I think this is what is definitely very important. Let's not forget that there is a global dimension, of course. No, we have a responsibility to organize our cities in a way that we can stay inside the planetary boundaries. And I would believe that now to sort of have a dispersed development and let people just go where they want to go would definitely not help that idea of becoming more resource efficient, even more circular as well, and make sure that we also respect the limits of our planet and respect the biodiversity as well. So I think there is definitely a call, a plea for all of us to ensure that the cities become higher quality places for being still attractive to people to live inside, to give them what they need, quality, health, safety, and ensure that we don't spoil the global sustainability necessities.
Ilona, I introduced you and explained that you were an expert in planning. Should we be encouraging people to live in cities? Is this the right starting point?
I think the best encouragement really is through offering better quality living spaces that allow you to feel safe, allow you to promote and sustain your health, allow to receive all the necessary public services. So it clearly is a complex issue that planners need to address in order to ensure that people are willing to live in the cities. According to the latest research done by the World Bank on the demographic trends, urbanization will continue at a slower pace, as we will see it, but by 2050, the number of inhabitants in the cities will reach 2/3 of the world population. So clearly, this is the responsibility of the whole planning community to ensure that people have this higher quality living space, this safer living space from the health perspective, so that they are not maybe encouraged to live, but they feel comfortable in this space and they are ready to be there.
And do you think the demographics will change? There's a great deal of speculation in London as we perhaps repurpose some buildings and turn them into dwellings, that it might be younger people who want to live there and older people not so much. Ilona.
Oh, sorry, that's still a question to me. Well, Another key demographic trend will be related to aging populations throughout the world, and we see that Europe is aging at a higher pace, is aging much quicker. So from that perspective, planners need to adapt their strategies to ensure that urban environments are livable for different generations, but also to older people. And from that perspective, also greening of cities and ensuring better quality living environments are very important. For younger generations, probably this is a combination of the working and living environment that is also an important aspect. Here, of course, we see that things have dramatically changed since the pandemic, considering that many of us have switched to teleworking, and basically living and working space has merged. And from that perspective, of course, also the quality of the living places and this issue has increased in importance.
Jette, we're hearing there about trends, and this is a UN figure, I believe, that was being quoted there by Ilona along the lines of something like 2/3 of people are going to live in cities by 2050. I think this is a UN figure. Does this mean that it's very important to have these public spaces? It feels that what you're saying is we almost need to put those in now in order that they exist. Otherwise, the danger is, with a lack of that type of planning, that we just sort of run out of space in a way. But we are expecting more people to live in cities. That's the factor. That's the fact.
Yeah, obviously, and I think it's important that you have an integral understanding of urban space, and we see that especially when in new urban developments, we are always, I mean, we have done that since our inception, but we put the landscape, the understanding of the environmental context in the center of the development as a catalyst for the building development. I think that's actually quite interesting because it's an inverse understanding of space. So you think from the so-called negative space and how it kind of impacts then the densities and the distribution accordingly. So I think it's a different way of thinking when you put accessibility and public area and park area in the center of your thinking. And that leads to a completely different understanding of urban environment, and I think also to another type of public ownership, because it's a quality that you're offering to the urban development.
Okay. Charles, I want to now move beyond what individuals might want and how they want to live, although that's a continual theme, and move to you, Charles, and talk a little bit more about technology. You talked actually about building materials a little bit and how that might change, or how that is changing in terms of the way that you're using them. But let's just come back to digitization and so on. How is that affecting the way that you are thinking that we will live in the future?
Well, certainly first design is certainly affected by digitalization. That's the first thing. Buildings, built-in factories now are no longer pre-built, but actually made according to the needs. So there is no limit to the aspect of the building. That's the very first element of that. Second element is, of course, that we have to concentrate, and that's what has happened, on different products that have been identified as non-noxious and which are neutral to the environment, which is why certainly wood is one element, because captured CO2 remains in the structure as long as it stands there. So that is also an element. Of course, digitalization should serve human purposes, I believe, also, and that is a major element. The one I mentioned about OPEX versus CAPEX is quite important, because there is this possibility now to just measure how many luxes I need in the dining room or in my living room, and just to pay per lux or lumen, whatever you calculate it with, instead of investing in bulbs or in different appliances. So digitalization is also important. For instance, when you're paying for one cycle of a washing machine, you will have to pay for the availability of the product, which would be something like €1 per day or something like that. And then you would pay an extra euro for one cycle. So these are examples which we have already implemented and which are really quite important. And the big data is playing a more and more important role in this respect. So yes, I think digitalization is on its way. It's coming anyway, because we've seen it, and smart cities are already existing. They are there. They will develop even more. But all these smart appliances, all this digitalization also has to serve the purpose of the people who are living in the city.
You're probably aware, Holger, if I can come to you, that in the UK we've had a problem with energy prices, and one of the reasons for that is that we don't store gas, and really much, and another reason is that because of our lurch towards renewable energy, we don't really have much capability to store that either. So the only solution really is that people become smarter about how they use energy. Is this part of how you think? And I'm interested broadly in how digitization has affected planning.
Well, definitely it has drastically. I mean, what you refer to is sort of the individual responsibility and the opportunity to use energy, but also material, but also other resources in like a responsible manner. But for sure, this is also true for cities and local governments by and large that do apply more and more smart city appliances in order to manage cities. I refer to the city of Mannheim, for example. There's many others that has developed like an urban platform. It is designed as an open data platform that will help actually to both engage citizens by opening up for different processes. I can talk about that a little bit more. But second, also to collect and provide data and information, turn that into visual information for different actors in the city. That might be private sector actors, it might be community groups, and it might be, of course, also the city itself. It goes as far as many cities currently think of developing a kind of digital twin of themselves in order to, for example, understand their vulnerabilities, help by that also disaster risk management, help the greenification, for example, by understanding where trees should be located in the city and what type of trees in order to maintain them over the long term, and overall really to be more efficiently managing, planning, and steering the city. So in that sense, it is very important. But let me say one sentence also in my capacity as a chair of a CEN technical committee that works on smart and sustainable cities and communities. What is very, very important is that we understand, and this is also an ISO definition, that smart is at service for sustainability. So is a purposed means to underpin a sustainable urban development. Digitalization is not a means in itself. It's not la pola. It should be working for people. It should be working for the cities.
Okay. Elena, let's come back to you then and ask, what does smart mean to you? What do we mean by smart? What might a smart city look like? How might it be joined up?
Well, as we are discussing today, moving cities from smart to human, I probably would like to say that nowadays smart should be human. So I would like to put an equalization sign between smart and human, considering that we should be moving to urban environments and urban living spaces that offer opportunities to work, to live, to receive services, to feel healthy, to sustain your health, to develop your capacities, to simply live a high quality life. And from that perspective, I believe that public policymakers have an increased responsibility to ensure that quality of life is something that increases. Not the economic development trends, not the number of smart technologies, but really the quality of life and how the inhabitants, the citizens feel in these urban environments. Because as I also showed in my slides, there is a clear demand. There is a clear demand by the European citizens to not just boost economic development or smart development of the cities, but to reorient the economies to new principles that would allow cities to become more resilient, to avoid, as far as possible, any next pandemics, to become more green, more sustainable, and more livable.
If I can come to you, Jette, when you are designing buildings, does the smartness or otherwise of the city matter to you? Do you, how does it underpin your thinking? Because exactly the point being made there by Ilona is that we need to think about human cities. And this is something that you specialize in, obviously, but I'm interested to know how a good low level of technology helps you do that.
Of course, there's an increased interest in smart cities, both on an urban and a building level. And I mean, what I think is most important, a basic understanding that the smart infrastructure should support the physical space on all levels, so support the performance. And we can see also on a building level that the interest is growing, but there is a lack of good framework still and competence. So, and also the expected impact of smart technology. But we see, of course, a great benefit using smart technology in the performance of environmental and environmental sustainability discussions and building performance. And our powerhouse project, for example, which I showed in my introduction, we have developed a tool called Smart by Powerhouse that helps you to measure the performance of the building and benefit for the environmental performance or to measure the energy consumption, for example, or to quantify the environmental impact of the building and also to tune the performance accordingly. So I think it's a very valuable tool, but of course it's more a support in terms of that the building works better in the end. It will not be, of course, any replacement. Yes.
But ultimately, to have that foundation is quite helpful to you, is what you're saying.
Yes, of course.
You have that foundation of technology.
Yeah, obviously, yeah. But we see that it requires, of course, also increase of competence. There's still quite a huge gap between a general understanding of a smart building and of a smart city, and so I think we should work with the competence level simultaneously. So I think that's an important part of the discussion also, so that the user is also able to benefit from all these kind of infrastructural possibilities.
Yeah. Charles, we've talked a little bit about the wealth gap and equality and so on, and also about public health. And I wondered if in your designs that is where that might feature on, you've talked about flammability of materials and safety of materials and so on. Is that where it features, or do you think also about sanitation and broader issues?
No, all aspects have to be covered. Sanitation, of course, is important, and having clean water, I think, is not taken for granted, but making sure that we release clean water is certainly not taken for granted, and that has to happen, reusing as much as possible the water we have. So that is definitely an element. I think also, and I mentioned that, close to parks and gardens, where you have a better way of life, and the possibility of doing sports is an important element. All this is actually including the countryside in the city, but you can do that through urban planning. But you can also do that by choosing the location of your different developments, which is what we are doing. So health is fundamental, and it's also safety. It covers all aspects. If you have bike lanes, well, you have a better chance of being healthy after several years of biking. If you don't, you have a good chance of having an accident. So all these elements have to be taken into consideration and are fundamental, especially because otherwise, what happens is that those who cannot afford the best locations and the best spaces will be actually rejected to areas which are less clean, less safe, and certainly not as nice to live in. And that is socially unacceptable, and I think it's also explosive.
Mm. Do you think that when we think about sustainability in terms of energy, heating and so on, that we will think of this at the level of a building or of a city? I mean, historically, we think of it really in terms of the city, the sanitation and so on. But do you think buildings will become more autonomous in this sense?
Buildings are becoming autonomous more and more. They're becoming autonomous in terms of the energy that they consume. They become autonomous in terms of the water that they consume. So I think certainly it is now possible. We've passed the time when we had to have district heating or district cooling. I've seen that with my own eyes in the Middle East, for instance, and there's a lot of waste in there because at the end of the day, nobody is really responsible. But the micro technology for all this is available and is implemented. And certainly central mechanical ventilation. The excellent HVAC systems that are implemented also exist. So I don't think there's one additional element actually, and it's actually Jeremy Rifkins who mentioned that buildings in the future should actually produce more energy than they are consuming, and that is possible. It's possible with urban turbines. Of course, some of them still have to be developed. As you know, turbines are more efficient when they are extremely high, and that is not what is needed in cities. But that is one possibility. Photovoltaic paints are being developed and produce energy. It's not only the panels on the roof, but also the facades of the buildings that are actually becoming sources of energy. So I think you have to look at the city, definitely, because there is a global picture, but you have to look at the buildings too, because every single building is also participating to the project.
Holger, what is your take on this? Do you think buildings will become more autonomous from an energy point of view, and it will be down to the management of the building rather than the people who manage the city?
Well, I believe it will remain a mix. Definitely, when we look at countries like Germany or the whole of Scandinavia or other countries, there is still district heating a very important feature. And actually, there is currently also a number of projects and activities going on in order to make district heating and cooling even better available and also more efficient. And I think if we look at sort of a resource efficiency perspective, that might still be an important element to look at. But at the same time, I completely agree with Charles that we will see really an evolution to autonomous buildings. The point or the question will be, is that connected just to new buildings, or can we have installations in existing buildings? The existing building stock is obviously for a long time still the majority of the buildings and constructions that we have in support of a just energy transition. Particularly also with a view to the residents and tenants currently being there, we need to find really good ways in order to ensure that there is a transformation also to an affordable housing while driving the energy transformation in support of our climate neutrality ambitions.
Ilona, if I can come to you, how far down this path are we, do you think? How much more work is there to do?
Well, as I mentioned, since the start of the pandemic, cities were quite quick to react and to act and to implement first solutions in order to promote the sustainability of places, to ensure that they are safe to live and work. And I also presented some examples of those solutions that already cities started to implement from the very start of the pandemic. And we see that new urban forests are being grown, and the number of new cycle lanes have been established in thousands of kilometers so far. But of course, there is much more work to do by the cities. And of course, as somebody who has been working for quite some time with urban and regional planning, and I see that local governments, that cities and regional authorities are very well placed to react, and not only quickly, but also in a sustainable way. But coming back to my point, I really believe that there's much more work to do, and especially in the fields that require more cooperation of local authorities beyond administrative borders, because everything, all the challenges that we are talking about, either it's a pandemic or it's climate environmental issues, they transcend administrative borders. So what is very important, either in the field of circular economy or in the field of promoting green infrastructure or new ways of promoting economic development and smart solutions, there is a clear demand and need for local authorities to work together, to join forces, to expand the impact and the effect of these solutions. At the same time, it is also very important that public authorities do not engage in promoting urban development alone. Partnerships with private actors, partnerships with non-governmental organizations, with international organizations are very crucial. So considering the scale of the problematics that we have in the urban development, it really requires, rather than individual local solutions, it requires joint local response to ensure a much higher impact in the long term.
I'm going to now go to Caroline Schuler and check in with her and how her drawings are going. She's summarising what it is that we're talking about, so let's take a look at how she's getting on. There were some trees and some sewage systems appearing. There we are, human cities, build more resilient and greener. I'm just having a look, I can't quite see on the right hand. Oh, there we go. Digitalisation. There on the right hand side, and of course it really has to be for the benefit of the people who live in the city rather than a technological end in itself. Where will people want to live as the pandemic passes by, she says optimistically, and cities will continue to grow. That's something that we've been talking about, so we have to plan for that. We also have some questions coming in from the audience, and I want to continue to ask that they do. And it's about the private sector, and I think this is probably yet something that I should direct to you. It says here, a lot of developments, building offices, for example, in cities, are done by private investors. So how can we convince them to do sustainable and green investments, even if it is to the detriment of their financial profit? Jette.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and that we are, of course, facing the same challenge from time to time. It's really about kind of long-term thinking. First of all, let's start with an ambition that you have also a kind of responsibility when you're a private developer, if you're working with your portfolio, that you do kind of positive contribution to urban development. So you have to, we also work actively in these terms of discussion, setting the standards from the very beginning. But secondly, it's also about, of course, developing energy positive building in terms of building costs still requires a higher development and also construction budget. But if you are able to think 5 or 10 years ahead, you will then have a positive contribution to the budget again, and not thinking only in short-term investment. I think that requires a different strategic approach, but also, of course, it's easier when you're keeping your development within your portfolio, so you're able to kind of include that in your assessment as well.
Yes. Holger, that feels like a planning question, a financial planning question, doesn't it?
It is also a financial planning question for sure. First of all, let me say I was very happy for Ilona mentioning the necessity for global cooperation between cities, which is all about what ICLEI does. We are a global network of cities that do nothing else than rethinking cities in regard of sustainability. Second, the point on the sort of collaboration with the private sector. Of course, it is the public authorities and local governments that set framework conditions for private sector to work within, and that is usually also in partnership with private sector. One element in that is definitely planning, so to provide and present sort of the building standards, but also the public space standards. Standards is an important element in that, of course, but also in their public procurement. Alone in Europe, we have, I believe it is 1.5 trillion euro in public authorities' budget to be spent. So what is this for? It is definitely also to organize services with the private sector. And if we applied criteria, not best value for the cheapest price, but social return on investment, nature return on investment for the selection criteria, procurement criteria, that might actually be very, very powerful and be sort of an engine to also induce private sector rethinking. The last point I would like to make here is definitely standard and standardization. This is private sector interest. I mean, standards are all about global trade, and more we see that standards turn to include and embed sustainability criteria. And this is for good reasons, because at the end of the day, many business actors start to understand that only embedding sustainability criteria will give them a business opportunity in the long term. And of course, that has much to do then also with the financial aspects in public authorities. Where do we direct the budgets towards? But it also means a challenge or like a task for the collaboration between public sector, local authorities, but also financiers and investors to ensure that we can create a scale that is interesting both for private investors but also for financiers like the European Investment Bank.
Charles, I'm intrigued to know what you think about this question, whether the private sector needs incentivising in some way to go down this route. I'm assuming that your answer is no, given what you do, but that you know it doesn't necessarily these objectives aren't necessarily aligned with the bottom line.
Well, yeah, partly I agree. On the other hand, I think yes, fiscal policies could be used, for instance, and the cost is low as long as the project is small. And we've seen that with different projects. I think governments have the possibility to kickstart a lot of projects by just granting some fiscal interest. It doesn't cost much because, as I said at the beginning, there is little happening anyway. But on the other hand, it really helps. And now, on the other hand, I have to say that we're not talking about human cities only and smart cities. We're also talking about smart economy and human economy. And when we are developing projects, we have to make sure that they are also sufficiently profitable for investors. Because if it's not the case, well, we will end up in a dead end. And I think that is also a challenge, and it's an interesting challenge. It keeps us really high on our heels and makes sure that we develop not only sustainable and human buildings, but also profitable buildings.
There's also a question here, Charles, about your build to rebuild idea. Could you just explain what you mean by that? What is the thinking about that?
Well, from the very beginning, you use materials that will not be regarded as waste at the end of the cycle of life of the product. I mean, we don't even talk about life anymore. It's really every single element of the building are being reused. And there's a discussion on every single element, and I'll just give you an example to understand. If you talk about window frames can be made of basically wood, PVC, aluminum, or steel. If you have steel frames, you will have to melt them unless at the end of the cycle the same size of frame can be reused in another building. So that requires some kind of standardization. So this is, and the same applies to aluminum, for instance. But we know that steel and aluminum are quite expensive to transform, and the value of the frame is almost lost at the end because it's melted. PVC is a bit different. The cost of reusing PVC, and it can be reused 7 times. And assuming that enough standardization is available, this is really possible. Now, there is also an element of regulation there. You might know that when you use a non-new element in a building today, no insurer is actually going to insure the building, and no guarantee will be given on the building because some of the elements are not new. And we certainly have to develop also a new framework in this respect to make sure that we standardize some elements. Why would you discard a window frame and destroy all its value but the minerals if the window frame is still quite good and can be reused? So it's really challenging, but it's really exciting. And I mentioned only window frames, but we could talk about steel beams. We could talk about basically any element. And so, yes, what we do now is we build with elements that can be reused, but it's very, very important, and that's the principle also of cradle to cradle and circular economy, is that these elements are reused afterwards. And some things have to change also in this respect.
Okay, so that's the sort of recycle materials aspect to it. I'm thinking also about another type of versatility, and if I can come to you, Jette. There's been discussion in London about the possibility of planning permission changing. I mentioned this at the beginning, such that, for example, retail spaces or indeed office spaces could be transformed into apartments. Is that going to be part of our thinking now, that when a building is built, that it has that type of versatility?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is not a new phenomenon. The flexibility of spaces is always a part of planning and laying out the building components and areas and programs. But I think an important part that it shouldn't compromise the identity of a building. So I think flexibility and reuse of space should more also include the creative adaptation. So at least from a personal point of view, I think it's important that we don't end up with the neutrality of space. It should always be based on a contextual understanding of the situation you're developing in, and then also have a quality also in terms of lifespan that it allows for reuse in several times. I think it's more about the quality of space rather than providing a neutral flexibility that allows future changes. I think you can see great examples. For example, the reuse of former monasteries into cultural spaces, into residential areas, or churches, or what we are doing now with the Slaughterhouse project in Milan. I mean, it's more about that you reuse the long-lasting construction component, like concrete constructions, and that you replace them, but that the basis allows you to reuse the space. So maybe that was a little bit a more complex answer to a simple question, yes, but definitely the transformation of space is part of any planning process and flexibility.
Okay, Charles, I'm coming back to you. The question is this: if a building material is trendy, it will be lacking and multiple price increase. How do you handle that? I think they're talking here recently, celluloid wood-based price debacle recently. I think it's talking about if you buy a property that you want it to hold its value. I think this is the aspect of this question.
Yeah, that's absolutely clear, and it's a very, very important element. Basically, you want the property to keep its value, and just to come back to your previous point, we have calculated that the extra cost of building a new building in a flexible way, allowing, for instance, a garage or a parking building to be converted into residential or into offices, that involves an additional cost of 15 to 18%. If you look at that, it's actually quite low, because it gives you a residual value which is much, much higher. Cities are living beings. They are evoluting, and so I think it's really fundamental to see that if we don't need parking lots in the same quantity or in the same location in 20 years' time or in 30 years' time, the building will just be good to be scrapped. But if it has been built in a proper way, it can be easily turned into a residential building, for instance. What does it mean? Well, a parking lot requires about 2.20 meters of height, available height. If you want to have a residential area, you need about 2.60. So it's just a little volume more. It's just one element. And I think if it has been taught at the beginning, if it has been developed in a way that it's flexible, then suddenly there's an added value. And I really believe that in development, developers and investors should look at that element. There's also another element. If you want a building to keep its value, there's this element of building materials as banks. And that is, I think, quite important. Nowadays, a large building costs about 300,000 euro to be scrapped, because it has to be depolluted, etc., etc. And a small building is more going to be in the area of 30,000. If you regard in 20, 30 years' time a building that has been properly built, where you can recover all the sub-elements, and is then a positive value, you end up with a positive value in your books and not a liability. So that's where the finance is also an important element, and where the contribution of the financial element comes to the profitability of the whole project.
Charles, thank you very much indeed. I just want to do one sentence answer from all of you as to, for our audience who might want a bit of homework, where it is that they might go for inspiration in terms of either a building or some sort of nature-based solution or even a material. So if I could start with you, Holger, do you have a place that you look that gives you inspiration, or a building, or a city even?
I would go to Network Nature, which provides you with an enormous amount of wonderful examples of cities that apply green infrastructure and nature-based solutions.
Ilona, to you. Where should we look for inspiration?
Well, there are, of course, plenty of examples. It's difficult to choose one, but first thing that came to my mind is Ghent in Belgium. That I think is also a wonderful example of greening and promoting various green solutions and promoting healthy living within a city and sustainable living of the city.
Very interesting. Ghent, okay, in Belgium. And Jette, do you look to your own buildings, or where do you look to for inspiration?
No, I don't think that we have to travel so far. I mean, taking Oslo as one of the Scandinavian capitals that has been under tremendous development over the last 10 years, also in terms of environmental ambition from the municipality, transforming huge inner city areas into pedestrian areas and so forth. So we don't have to travel so far. It's really interesting what's going on here.
Oslo is a lovely, lovely city. Yeah. I've been there a few times, and it's truly gorgeous to hang out in. Charles, inspiration?
Well, two. First, I can certainly talk about the city where I'm operating, which is the smallest European capital and one of the smallest cities in Europe. But it has also the advantage of having everything beforehand and have a lot of greenery all around. So it's not a flat land. There are some mountains all around. So that's certainly one source of inspiration. And I do believe that cities of reasonable size offer certainly a lot of advantages in terms of quality of life. So, but then the other inspiration, and which I think is fundamental, is actually the human beings and the citizens. Because if you listen to what they are aspiring to, if you are looking at what their future is, then you already come with very, very interesting solutions, and you start building inclusive cities, which I think to me is the most human city you can build.
Thank you very much indeed to all of you. I'm just going to go a final time to Caroline Schuller, who is drawing away from us, for us, and has no doubt drawn inspiration for her painting. There we are, human cities, for more resilient, greener and human cities, and the location, the connectivity, quality of life, energy positive buildings. That's one of the many interesting concepts I think that have come up during the course of our discussion, and put people and their quality of life and sustainability in the centre of urban planning. I'd like to thank our panellists once again for joining us, Ilona and Holger and Charles, and also Jette. Thanks to all of you. And I'd like now to hand over to Brian Field. He is the European Investment Bank's specialist in spatial development planning, spatial development, I should say, rather than planning. Brian, just to hand over to you for some final thoughts.
Thank you, Tanya. I hope you can all hear me. Apologies for the backdrop, but they weren't able to perform their trickery and impose a nice backdrop, and I'm broadcasting to you from my study at home. I really did very much enjoy the debate. I thought USG Sharif's opening presentation in terms of strategy was excellent, and it was complemented well by the panelists with their examples. and their case studies. I would like to just try and draw the various components together by making a couple of observations. First of all, if we look at USG Sharif's presentation, she talked about the Sustainable Development Goals, and she particularly emphasized the new urban agenda, which the UN is promoting, and UN Habitat in particular are promoting as we go forward with planning. Now, what is interesting is that Sustainable Development Goal 11, the development of more sustainable cities and communities, how do we do this against the backdrop of the climate change imperatives, which we as a society also have to address? Well, what I find particularly interesting is that as the climate change agenda has gathered pace, planners were starting to rethink some of their theories and some of their propositions in terms of urban development. And in the wake of climate change, against the backdrop of the need to reduce our carbon emissions, there was clearly, and to allow the developing world to make progress so that we could address the SDGs in general, there was a consensus that urbanization was a good thing, but we needed to promote it in a fashion where we went with more concentrated development, more concentrated and mixed use development to reduce travel demand, to encourage people to walk, to encourage people to cycle, to be near work, higher densities so that we could minimize the land take from rural areas with urbanization. So instead of having sprawling cities, we had more concentrated cities, and in essence, better integration of the built and natural environments. The backdrop was the promotion of green growth and the circular economy. Now, green growth, I think it's a bit of a tautology, the expression. In fact, it's almost an oxymoron, but I'll come back to that in a second. What the pandemic did was, the pandemic challenged these propositions. And remember, the pandemic came after the new urban agenda and after agreement on the SDGs. The pandemic has emphasized the need for less concentrated development, more dispersed settlement patterns rather than more concentration, lower densities, and less growth. Less growth. I mean, that's what it's saying. We need to be doing less. What's happened is the pandemic has obliged us to challenge some of the propositions which were informing the way that we were dealing with the growing pace of urbanization and the need to address the increasing global poverty as a result of these urbanization pressures. What's happened is it's obliged us to focus on what has fast become a zero-sum game. What do I mean by that? I mean that the global north, the so-called developed world, needs to make sacrifices to facilitate the development of the global south. So that we can have the bandwidth for the global south to make progress, the global north has to make sacrifices. I was talking to a colleague at the bank only yesterday, and he drew the analogy between Malawi and the Netherlands. Similar populations, similar sized countries. What's interesting is that per capita in the Netherlands, they generate 10 times the carbon, or they pump 10 times the carbon into the atmosphere that they do in Malawi. It's actually 40 times if you allow for consumption differences between households. It would only need a modest increase in the Netherlands' nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement, let's say a 10% increase in that contribution, to allow Malawi to follow a similar development pathway and achieve and deliver on the SDGs in time for 2030. In other words, what I'm saying is that as a planet, we have reached, or we fast reached, the limits to growth. We fast reached the limits to growth. And now the global north has to start making sacrifices to facilitate development in the global south. Now, what I found interesting about this whole presentation, this whole panel exercise, is that all of the case studies were from the global north, but in the strategic discussion at the beginning, the focus was on the needs of the global south. I think I've made some notes here, what the debate has highlighted is that we need to rethink the form and function of cities. The form and function that we were going with in the wake of climate change to accommodate urbanization has been challenged by the pandemic, and against this backdrop, we need to have a more considered analysis of a sensible way forward. I think we need to move away from what I call attractive slogans, build back better. I mean, what on earth does build back better mean? Everyone seems to be using it at the moment. I think we have to move away from these slogans, and these slogans, they always have just three words. Everyone likes 3 words. The PR executives have told them that's what you've got to go for. You've got to go for a 3 words slogan, and that way everyone will listen. I'm afraid I don't agree. I think we have to move away from these slogans to more meaningful planning policies, and more meaningful planning policies involve lengthier slogans. How about build back clean, green, and climate friendly? That tells you what you want to do and what you want to achieve. And that's the sort of slogan that I'd like to see as we respond to the needs for more sustainable development going forward. I think that USG Sharif's presentation provided us with the makings of a strategy. And I think what we need is an integrated strategy at the global level, where there is cooperation across the patch between the global north and the global south, so that the global north can make the sacrifices that are necessary for the global south to be afforded the bandwidth to develop. But I also think that within the context of this integrated global strategy, the policies need to be delivered locally, and this is what was so beautifully illustrated by the panelists with their case studies. Because all of the examples that were given have currency both in the global north, as it attempts to make sacrifices to create this bandwidth for development in the global south, but it also has currency, or they also have currency in the global south as it progresses along this development pathway. These are just my thoughts, my very quick thoughts. I'm afraid I had to cobble together some comments against the backdrop of this online technology, which hasn't delivered very clear presentations in my loft and on my computer, and I missed some of what some of the panelists said, but I think they deserve to be congratulated. And I think EIB, I think the University of Luxembourg, I think Caritas, I think the EIB Institute in particular needs to be congratulated on bringing together this series of events which are encouraging a debate and encouraging us to challenge the conventional wisdom as we move forward and attempt to deal with this massive global challenge that we have of climate change. I think one thing is clear, and one thing that the debate today has demonstrated is that business as usual is no longer the way forward. I think a second and perhaps less clear message is that current measures and current metrics that we use to measure our progress as a society principally around concepts of economic growth, are probably no longer fit for purpose, because we need to be doing less. And I think we need to be developing metrics which don't attempt to monetize everything and to give us a global growth figure. We need to develop more meaningful metrics that encapsulate measures that focus on the quality of life and the equity with which, or the equitability with which, society's scarce resources are exploited and distributed to the benefit of the planet as a whole, rather than to the benefit of particular constituencies. Sorry if that sounds a bit like a sermon, but that's how I interpreted today's presentations and today's session, and I very much look forward to participating in future exercises of a similar nature. Thank you very much.
That's it for this edition of October Days for Sustainable Development, brought to you by the European Investment Bank. I want to thank all of our panellists once again, and all of the speakers who took part today, and also you for watching. Bye-bye.